A silent night on a Christmas Eve on the Western Front. When we think of the Western Front during the Great War, or World War I, the images which come to mind are those of the senseless slaughter of millions of young men across Europe, particularly in northern France and in Belgium, the incessant artillery barrages, the continuing chatter of machine guns, of poison gas, no man's land, barbed wire, what Winston Churchill once described as the throwing of mankind against cement and sand and wire. And of course, these are the correct images. The Great War was the most purposeless and senseless contest ever undertaken in the history of warfare. Its battles were such that the French, for example, lost no less than 500,000 soldiers, shelled and gassed to death in a vast graveyard, which was turned over every day for 2 months at Verdun. 500,000 men. They couldn't even bury them because they were so, bodies were so shelled that they had no more any dog tags on them. Or consider a morning in July 1st, 1916, when the British kicked off the Somme offensive. By the end of that first day's fighting, the British had lost no less than 62,000 dead and dying young men trapped out in no man's land. World War I produced a lot of results, a lot of change. It was the end of the old world. It produced the end of 5 monarchies, the inception of 13 new republics, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq, and the groundwork for the 2 worst evils of the 20th century, namely fascism and communism. And yet there was a moment on a Christmas Eve, 89 Christmas Eves ago, when ordinary men, under extraordinary circumstances, tried to reach out to one another across the onrushing gap of hatred and violence, a time when the Western world seemed poised to drop into the abyss of total evil. On Christmas Eve of 1914, the foul weather which had pummeled the soldiers all through October and November and early December finally abated, and the weather cleared that Christmas Eve afternoon. The war at this time was only 4 months old, but by that time up in Flanders and Ypres in Belgium, the soldiers on both sides shared the realization that the war was not going to be over soon, and that we are not going home, and we are going to live in trenches underground like animals, with filth, feces, and fleas, rats and cockroaches, and the stench of death for an indefinite period of months or years. They knew that. The German High Command on Christmas Eve in 1914 shipped thousands of Christmas trees up to the front. At twilight that night, the German soldiers began placing candles on the trees and the parapets facing the enemy. The British and the French were astonished. And suddenly, on that still evening, they began to hear the most beautiful and the most haunting and heartbreaking of all Christmas songs for some reason. Stille Nacht, Heilige Night, Silent Night, Holy Night. Soon, both sides were calling out, "Don't shoot, we'll meet you at the middle." And so, in small groups at first, but in very large groups, and very quickly, soldiers in opposing armies, British, French, Belgian, German, climbed up out of their burrows and began exchanging cigarettes, schnapps, brass buttons, souvenirs. It was out in no man's land on that vast Western Front, which stretched all the way from the North Sea, from Ostend up at the North Sea, all the way down to the Swiss border, 450 miles. They were all converging out in no man's land that Christmas Eve of 1914. It was, of course, strictly forbidden. The non-com officers joined in with the troops, and the higher officers joined in with the troops once in a while, but they tried to sometimes just turn their backs and pretend they didn't see. But of course, the German High Command suddenly got wind of it. They said, "Verboten. This is verboten." The British commander of the Second Corps reported to his superiors that these incidents were taking place, and he said in his report they were, quote, "illustrative of the apathetic state that the British soldiers are gradually sinking into." He proposed that they would be disciplined. A corporal, an Austrian corporal who was fighting on the German front, the German army, named Adolf Hitler, was quoted as saying, quote, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no sense of German honor at all?" But the facts that the incidents were so spontaneous, so kind, so outreaching was remarkable. All the shells went silent. This is all according to a new book written by a man named Stanley Weintraub called Silent Night. Down in the French sector, a member of the Paris Opera sang, "O Holy Night." And further down the line, trumpets of men who had recently played in the Berlin Opera serenaded the French with Adeste Fideles, "So Come All Ye Faithful." It couldn't continue. It wasn't allowed to. The high commands immediately got a grip on the situation and started the guns up again, and Europe thereafter tipped into the abyss of total ruin. No one realized that horrendous bloodletting that was going to follow in the next 4 years. There have been other episodes of fraternization during wars. Homer tells about the Greeks and the Trojans agreeing to long ceasefires between lines so they could bury their dead. During the American Civil War, when the two armies camped opposite one another on the Rappahannock River in Virginia, there was a lot of exchange, of course, partly because they spoke the same language. But there on the Rappahannock line, between battles, Union soldiers would float their little boats. They made boats out of newspaper, folded up newspaper. They sailed their boats with a little sail on it across the Rappahannock River to the Confederates who were waiting downstream. They would usually send over New York Herald, some of the Yankee newspapers, candy, which Confederates didn't have, Union did, but most of all what the Confederates couldn't get, which was coffee. Now, the Rebs, on the other hand, would sail their boats back downstream, once again, to the Union, and they would have what the Northern soldiers could not get, which is tobacco. Over the years, in some of the diaries, the repartee between one side and the other has been recorded, and some of it is amusing. One fellow tells the story of a rebel at night. He's a scout, a sentinel, and he calls out. He says, "Hey, Yank, what outfit you from?" Yank and the other says, "We're from 54th Rhode Island." Rebel says, "The hell do you say? They ain't 54 people in Rhode Island." But these interludes all seem to have been more like truces proclaimed by the fighting men themselves towards one another, but I suspect this has frequently been the case between warring soldiers who often have more respect for the enemy on the other side of the line because he knows what he's going through. I know what I'm going through. I know what he's going through. They respect the other side often more so than they respect their officers. War is always such a tragedy. The British poet Thomas Hardy, in a World War I poem entitled "The Man He Kills," tells of a British soldier and a German soldier facing one another across no man's land. Thomas Hardy's poet protagonist says, "I shot at him and he at me. I killed him in his place. Well, then he thinks, I shot him because my foe, he was my enemy, of course. Then he thinks, he probably joined the army for the same reason that I did. He probably was out of work. He sold his traps. He probably was like me." And he said, he concludes the poem by saying, "Had I met him in a tavern, I would have treated him to half a pint or loaned him half a crown. Instead," he says, "I shot him where he stood." Well, wars persist, killings persist, hatreds persist, religious extremists persist. If there's any significance, any relevance to the story of the flickering candles in the darkness of no man's land 89 years ago on Christmas Eve, it is this: civilized people must keep reaching out across the barbed wire of hatred to find common grounds and understandings with alienated peoples, then as now, perhaps particularly now, in what may seem the bitter winter of our discontent.